Ambassador Miller stood before the Galactic Council, the lone human representative among the towering aliens of the Interstellar Cooperative. Earth had only recently joined after centuries of isolation following humanity's recovery from environmental collapse. The aliens had discovered humans during their darkest hour and helped them rebuild. For 50 years, humans had been viewed as the rescued species, harmless, grateful creatures who needed protection. Earth's application to join the military coalition had been met with polite skepticism. Humans were small, fragile, and known for their art, music, and emotional displays. Many council members viewed them as children playing at war. The human petition for full military integration seems premature, said Councillor Vex, his translucent appendages rippling. Your species has contributed admirably to cultural exchange and medical research, but combat is another matter entirely. Miller maintained her diplomatic smile. After decades of condescension, humans had learned to play the long game. We understand your concerns, but we believe we can contribute uniquely to coalition defense. Your greatest weapons were dismantled during your recovery, noted Councillor Dren of the Karathi Empire. Your soldiers lack carapaces, enhanced strength, or natural weapons. What precisely would you contribute besides casualties? Before Miller could respond, the chamber doors opened. Captain Jack Torres of the Earth Marine Corps entered, his dress uniform pristine, eyes forward. He had been summoned as a military advisor, but Miller knew his presence was meant as theater, a human playing soldier among real warriors. Perhaps we should hear from an actual human warrior, suggested Councillor Tarn, mandibles clicking with amusement. Torres stepped forward, standing at precise attention. Captain Jack Torres, Earth Marine Corps, 5th Expeditionary Unit. Tell us, Captain. Vex leaned forward. Has your species ever faced true interstellar conflict? Have you any experience beyond simulations? No, Counselor, Torres answered evenly, but we have 4,000 years of documented warfare against ourselves. I personally served in what we called the Resource Wars before first contact. Internal conflicts are hardly comparable to void combat, dismissed Councillor Lyra, her feathers rustling. Torres nodded respectfully. Perhaps not. But humans have experience with a concept your translation software struggles with. We call them war crimes. A curious silence fell across the chamber. The translation matrix cycled through approximations, finding no direct equivalent. What manner of combat protocol is this? Asked Dren, genuinely puzzled. Torres met the alien's 4 eyes directly. They're not protocols, sir. They're prohibitions. Things we had to specifically forbid ourselves from doing to each other in war because we discovered we were capable of them. The chamber grew uncomfortably still. Miller watched the council members exchange glances as the implications settled. What precisely are these prohibitions? Councillor Vex asked, crystalline appendages shifting defensively. Torres stood motionless, his face betraying nothing. Permission to speak freely, Ambassador? He asked Miller. She nodded, though inwardly she tensed. This wasn't part of the diplomatic script. Torture of prisoners, mass execution of civilians, chemical and biological weapons designed for maximum suffering, environmental destruction as tactical advantage, targeting of medical personnel, systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war. Torres recited the list with clinical detachment. Human history required international laws against these practices because we kept implementing them. The council chamber erupted in murmurs. Several members activated privacy fields, their translator units blinking as they conferred privately. You speak of atrocities, said Councillor Lyra, her plumage flattened in distress. No sapient species would. Every human conflict has featured these elements, Torres interrupted. Our history isn't a record of battles, but of our struggle to maintain our humanity during them. Councillor Dren's upper limbs formed a gesture of dismissal. Ancient history. Your species has clearly evolved beyond such barbarism under our guidance. Torres's expression remained neutral. Sir, the last documented war crimes occurred 3 years before first contact. The prohibition exists because the capacity remains. Ambassador, Miller intervened smoothly. What Captain Torres is attempting to articulate is that humans approach conflict differently. We understand our own darkness. It makes us cautious, deliberate, and extraordinarily committed to rules of engagement. Councillor Tarn leaned forward. You're suggesting this makes humans better soldiers? This admission of savagery? I'm suggesting, Miller replied, that we understand what war truly costs, not just in resources or territory, but in soul. At the far end of the chamber, the oldest council member finally spoke. Elder Krith, whose species had survived 3 extinction-level wars, activated his speaking light. Tell me, Captain Torres, in these human conflicts, did your people ever fight against technologically superior forces? Torres nodded. Throughout our history, sir, we call it asymmetric warfare. And how did your kind fare? Krith's ancient eyes fixed on the human. We adapted, Torres said simply. We observed patterns, identified vulnerabilities, exploited psychology. The technological advantage typically erodes over time. Against your own kind, Dren scoffed. Against anyone who underestimated us, Torres corrected gently. Elder Krith made a sound that the translators couldn't process, something between amusement and recognition. Ambassador Miller, I believe I now understand why your species has requested military integration. 3 months after the council hearing, the Zylaxian incursion began. The Talax, a previously unknown species from the Galactic Rim, had bypassed the Coalition's early warning systems and struck 6 outposts simultaneously. Their technology was advanced, their tactics ruthless, and their communications untranslatable. The Coalition Military Command convened on Station Alpha, the massive installation that served as headquarters for joint operations. Ambassador Miller and Captain Torres represented Earth in the War Council. The Karathi Third Fleet has been completely destroyed, reported Admiral Zux, his carapace bearing fresh battle scars. The Talax ships move in formations we cannot predict, and use energy signatures we cannot track. General Mora of the Liran Dominion displayed tactical holograms. They've established forward bases on these 7 worlds. Conventional assaults have failed with 90% casualty rates. Councillor Dren, now serving as military liaison, gestured toward the humans. Perhaps our newest allies have insight. Captain Torres, would your war crimes be useful here? Torres ignored the barb. He studied the holographic displays intently, then raised a hand toward one of the captured outposts. What was the population of this moon before the attack? Approximately 30,000 Coalition citizens, answered Mora. The Talax have converted it to a forward supply depot. And we're certain no survivors remain? Torres asked. Thermal and biosign sweeps show only Talax life forms, confirmed Zux. All colonists are presumed eliminated. Torres nodded, then stepped forward. Request permission to deploy a human reconnaissance team to this location. Dren's mandibles clicked skeptically. Your species lacks both the biological adaptations and technological experience for such a mission. With respect, Torres replied, those perceived limitations may be our advantage. The Talax have engaged 5 Coalition species so far and have demonstrated familiar counter-tactics for each. They have no data on humans. Elder Krith, who had joined the War Council as an observer, raised a gnarled hand. I support Captain Torres's proposal. The risk is excessive, protested Zux. A full battle group couldn't retake that moon. We're not proposing to retake it, Miller interjected. We're proposing to understand it. No battle group, just 12 Marines. Dren's posture registered disdain. 12 unarmored bipeds against an entrenched enemy force? 12 humans trained in asymmetric warfare, Torres corrected. We don't need to win. We need to observe and exit undetected. After heated debate, the Council approved the mission with reluctance. 3 days later, a stealth transport dropped the human team 40 kilometers from the main Talax installation. No one expected them to return. 6 days after deployment, communications silence was broken by a single encrypted burst transmission from the human team. The War Council gathered to receive it. This is Major Roberts, Earth Marine Special Operations. Mission accomplished. Request extraction at coordinates attached. The Coalition commanders stared at the holographic display in disbelief. Further, data began streaming in. Detailed scans of Talax technology, behavioral observations, biological samples, and weapon schematics. Impossible, whispered Admiral Zux. They infiltrated the central command post. The extraction team found 11 Marines waiting at the rendezvous point. They carried with them a functioning Talax communication node and 3 data cores. When questioned about their missing teammate, Major Roberts answered simply, "Lieutenant Parker remained behind to ensure our exit. He knew the mission parameters." In the debriefing chamber, the Marines stood at attention before the War Council, their uniforms torn and stained with unknown substances. Their faces showed exhaustion, but no trauma. "Explain how you accomplished this," demanded Counselor Dren. Major Roberts glanced at Torres, who nodded for him to proceed. "We didn't approach this as a military operation," Roberts explained. "We studied the Talax as predators, not as enemies. We observed their patrol patterns for 2 days, identified their sensory limitations, and used primitive techniques to move undetected." "Primitive techniques?" echoed General Mora. "Mud to mask thermal signatures, animal blood to confuse olfactory sensors, mimicry of local fauna sounds." Roberts' expression remained professional. "Methods developed during guerrilla campaigns centuries ago on Earth." Ambassador Miller watched the council members' reactions with careful neutrality. This was the gamble. Revealing human capacity without triggering fear. "The Talax communication system is partially biological," Roberts continued. "It processes information through cellular structures rather than electronic pathways. We've identified how to disrupt it." Elder Krith leaned forward. "And Lieutenant Parker? The one who remained?" Roberts's face tightened momentarily. "He volunteered to test our disruption theory. When we accessed their command node, he interfaced directly with their biological systems using a neural link. It allowed us to temporarily blind their security grid while extracting the data cores." "He sacrificed himself," Zuck stated flatly. "No, sir," Roberts corrected. "He's completing his mission. The lieutenant is transmitting false tactical data through their network while gathering intelligence. He knew survival was unlikely, but considered the strategic advantage worth the risk." The council chamber fell silent. The concept was familiar to every military culture present. Sacrificing. One for many, but the calculated acceptance of such a fate struck them differently. "Your team performed beyond expectations," Dren finally acknowledged. "How should we proceed with this intelligence?" Captain Torres stepped forward. "We have a proposal for a coordinated counteroffensive based on the Talax vulnerabilities we've identified." As Torres outlined the strategy, Ambassador Miller noticed Elder Krith watching the humans with ancient, knowing eyes. The first phase of the human counteroffensive began 2 weeks later. Unlike the direct confrontations the Coalition had attempted previously, this strategy targeted communication and supply networks rather than Talax warships. Using the intelligence gathered by the Marine team, human tacticians had identified 3 critical weaknesses in Talax operations. Their biological communication systems were vulnerable to specific frequencies. Their hierarchical command structure couldn't adapt to simultaneous threats. And their psychological profile indicated an almost religious adherence to efficiency. "They don't understand waste as strategy," Torres had explained to the skeptical council. "They won't defend what they consider expendable." The Coalition deployed small strike teams to 17 seemingly insignificant locations throughout Talax-controlled space. Each team included at least 2 human advisors. Their mission wasn't to engage in direct combat, but to create cascading system failures that would force predictable responses. Ambassador Miller observed the operations from Coalition Command with Elder Krith at her side. The ancient alien had become an unexpected ally, advocating for human tactical integration despite objections from more conservative council members. "Your species fights differently than the others," Krith remarked as they watched the tactical displays. "They fight for glory, for territory, for resources. Your kind fights to end fighting." "We've had too much practice," Miller replied. On the primary display, Coalition forces withdrew from a minor outpost, apparently defeated. The Talax moved in to secure it, exactly as predicted. "Now," Torres commanded from his position as tactical advisor. Throughout the sector, hundreds of automated drones activated simultaneously. They didn't attack Talax ships or personnel. Instead, they broadcast specifically calibrated electromagnetic pulses that disrupted the biological components of Talax communication systems. Across 17 sectors, Talax forces suddenly found themselves isolated from Central Command. Their rigid hierarchy couldn't function without constant connection to superior officers. As predicted, they defaulted to preset protocols, consolidating forces around what they perceived as high-value targets. They're evacuating the tertiary outposts, reported Admiral Zux with surprise, just as Captain Torres predicted. They're maximizing efficiency in response to communication loss, Torres explained. Standard human tactic. Force your enemy to choose between objectives by threatening multiple targets simultaneously. As the Talax consolidated their forces, they exposed their supply lines. Coalition strike teams moved in, not to destroy, but to manipulate. Cargo manifests were altered, navigation data corrupted, environmental systems subtly recalibrated. We're not winning through superior firepower, Miller explained to the Council. We're creating a theater of errors. Each small failure compounds until their entire system becomes unreliable. Over the next 6 days, Talax operations grew increasingly erratic. Their previously impenetrable formations became predictable as they responded to phantom threats and false intelligence. Then, unexpectedly, all Talax communication ceased across the entire theater of operations. "What's happening?" demanded Counselor Dren. "Have they developed a countermeasure?" Torres studied the data with narrowed eyes. "No. This is Lieutenant Parker." Lieutenant Parker had survived. After embedding himself in the Talax biological communication network, he had slowly introduced syntax errors into their language protocols. Over weeks, these errors accumulated, creating mistranslations and false commands that rippled through their command structure. "It's a form of information warfare we developed centuries ago," Torres explained to the astonished Council. "We called it a logic bomb, code designed to function normally until specific conditions trigger catastrophic failure." The Talax communication network had collapsed from within, leaving their forces in disarray. Coalition ships reported that Talax vessels were withdrawing to defensive positions, abandoning their forward momentum for the first time since the conflict began. 3 days later, a Coalition probe recovered Lieutenant Parker's unconscious body from a derelict Talax command ship. He was placed in medical stasis and transported to Station Alpha for treatment. While Parker remained unconscious, the War Council convened to assess the shifting conflict. The Talax retreat had created a strategic pause, but intelligence suggested they were regrouping rather than surrendering. "We've bought time, not victory," Admiral Zux cautioned. "Their technological advantage remains overwhelming." Captain Torres and Ambassador Miller had prepared for this moment. They presented the Council with what they called Phase 2, a direct diplomatic approach. "We now understand enough about Talax communication to attempt meaningful contact," Miller explained. "Lieutenant Parker's time in their network provided critical linguistic patterns. Diplomacy?" Counselor Dren's mandibles clicked in disbelief. "After they've destroyed 6 colony worlds?" "Yes," Torres stated firmly. "Because we recognize what's happening. The Talax aren't conquering. They're expanding in the only way they understand. Their biological communication system requires continuous connection. Isolation is death to them." Elder Krith nodded slowly. "You believe they're seeking connection, not conquest." "We believe they're following biological imperatives," Miller clarified. "Their attacks target our communication arrays first because they're attempting to integrate our systems with theirs. The violence occurs when integration fails." The debate continued for hours, with Coalition military leaders arguing for pressing their advantage while the Talax were vulnerable. Eventually, Elder Krith called for a vote. "Humanity has demonstrated tactical insight that has shifted this conflict in our favor," the ancient alien said. "I move that we authorize their diplomatic initiative." By narrow margin, the Council approved. A specialized communication vessel was prepared, incorporating technology that could interface with Talax biological systems without risking contamination. As preparations continued, Lieutenant Parker awoke in the medical bay. Captain Torres visited him immediately. "Did it work?" Parker asked weakly. Torres nodded. "Better than expected. You've changed the course of the war." "Not a war," Parker corrected, his eyes unfocused. "They don't understand warfare as we do. They understand communion." He struggled to find words. "I was inside their collective. They don't recognize individual consciousness as we know it. What they're doing to us? It's what they do to themselves to grow." Torres stared at his subordinate. "You're saying they don't see this as conquest?" They see it as evolution, Parker whispered. They believe they're helping us. The diplomatic vessel Harmony approached the Talax defensive line without escort. Ambassador Miller led the mission, with Captain Torres serving as military advisor and Lieutenant Parker, still recovering, as communications specialist. The small, human team had created a hybrid interface system that could translate their concepts into the Talax biological language framework. Parker, having experienced their collective consciousness, provided critical insights into their cognitive patterns. They don't have words for treaty or ceasefire, Parker explained as they prepared. Their closest concept is mutual growth boundary. They understand symbiosis, not separation. As the Harmony entered Talax space, enormous biomechanical ships surrounded them. The aliens made no hostile moves, but maintained positions that would allow immediate destruction of the human vessel. Broadcasting initial greeting pattern, Parker announced, activating the interface system. The response came not as communication, but as a biological probe that attached itself to the ship's hull. It extended filaments that sought connection, points. They're responding as expected, Parker said calmly. They want direct interface. Ambassador Miller nodded. Proceed with Phase 3. Torres activated a specialized chamber containing a controlled Talax biological sample recovered during the reconnaissance mission. The sample connected to the probe, creating a limited biological linkage that allowed communication without risking the ship or crew. Neural translation active, Parker reported. They're curious. They recognize my patterns from my time in their network. They're asking why we resist communion. Miller stepped forward. Transmit our first proposal, the symbiosis framework. For hours, the humans engaged in what could only loosely be called negotiation. The Talax had no concept of borders or sovereignty as separate entities. Their entire civilization functioned as a vast biological network with distributed consciousness. Parker, drawing on his unique experience, gradually helped them understand that humans and other coalition species required independence to thrive, that forced communion destroyed rather than enhanced. I'm introducing the concept of consensual connection, Parker explained, using their biological imperatives as framework. Torres watched the exchanges with growing amazement. This wasn't traditional diplomacy or military resolution. It was something uniquely human, adapting to an utterly alien mindset by finding common values beneath the conflict. Finally, Parker looked up from the interface, exhaustion evident on his face. They understand. They're proposing what we might call a phased integration protocol. Voluntary exchange of biological communication technology without forced assimilation. Peace, Miller translated simply. More than peace, Parker corrected. They're offering to help us develop our own version of their communication network. One that respects individual consciousness while allowing deeper connection than our current technology permits. When the Harmony returned to Coalition space, 3 days later, it brought with it the framework for ending the conflict and beginning a new form of interspecies cooperation. The Talax would withdraw from conquered territories in exchange for authorized research outposts where voluntary cultural and technological exchange could occur. In the council chamber, the coalition leaders received the news with astonishment. You turned an overwhelming military threat into a technological alliance, Councillor Dren stated, mandibles twitching in what humans had learned to recognize as respect. Elder Krith turned his ancient eyes to Captain Torres. When you first spoke of your species' war crimes, I recognized something the others did not. A species that must forbid itself from certain actions has contemplated their possibility, has faced its own darkness. Ambassador Miller nodded. Humans aren't gentle by nature. We're gentle by choice and discipline. We understand violence intimately enough to recognize when it's unnecessary, and to find alternatives that others cannot imagine, Elder Krith added. The Coalition welcomes humanity's full integration into our defense forces, not despite your history, but because of it. As the council session concluded, Torres found Lieutenant Parker standing at a viewport, watching distant ships moving in the void. Something on your mind, Lieutenant? Torres asked. Parker turned, his eyes reflecting starlight. I was inside. Their collective consciousness, sir. I saw what they were trying to achieve. It wasn't evil, just profoundly alien. He paused. I wonder how many of our wars throughout history were the same. Not malice, just failure to understand. Torres nodded slowly. That's why we're valuable here. Humans have made every possible mistake with each other. We've had practice learning from them. Together, they watched as a Talax vessel approached the station, not as conqueror, but as the first diplomatic delegation from a former enemy. The ship's organic hull pulsed with patterns of light that seemed almost like an invitation. "I never thought I'd say this, sir," Parker remarked, "but sometimes understanding war crimes is the first step to preventing them." Torres smiled faintly. "That, Lieutenant, is precisely why humans are here.